Well, there's nobody out there. I sure wish my family was here because with this over-the-top stage, I'm finally 6 foot tall. And Faye mentioned Sinsinawa, and I have to tell you that standing before you right now on stage is the only Lutheran who's ever spent one night in the convent at Sinsinawa. And yes, I did have my own building with 300 rooms in it. It's something of a lovely coincidence that I would be here with you today on your 25th anniversary of the founding of this wonderful, very unique get-together. Because 25 years has become, well, it's the length of one generation. And it's become somewhat of a theme of mine lately. And we're all familiar with the old saying that if you don't like things, just stick around, they'll change. Well, if you indeed take the advice and stick around 25 years, everything changes. The food changes even, the people, the fashion, even farming. And by that I mean, 25 years ago, if you had mentioned the internet, which incidentally is 25 years old next week, if you'd have mentioned the internet 25 years ago, most people would want to know what kind of fishing you were doing. And good grief, cellular phones, they came in a bag, remember? A big bag. And, the word Facebook was 2 words back then, and it meant nothing. Now, you and I and everyone else can't imagine a world without any of those things. And, equally true, 25 years before then, no one had heard of genetically modified seeds, and now few in American agriculture and hardly anyone at American land-grant universities can mention farming without mentioning GM seeds, quote, feeding the world, unquote. Well, it was the same way 25 years before that, even, when American agriculture began their chemical warfare on food against anything that anyone labeled a pest. I mean, it didn't matter if it was wildlife or weed-like, if it had 2 legs, 4 legs, 8 legs, or how many ever legs it's got today. And it was where it shouldn't be. We drowned it, drilled it, or doused it. It was cheap and effective and labor-saving, and in short, it was the American dream. I remember my father stirring a bucket of atrazine, powdered atrazine, with his arm, and then pouring the atrazine in the sprayer, which was a 55-gallon barrel on the back of his drawbar. And 25 years before that, you never heard of anhydrous ammonia, hybrid seed corn, 4-wheel drive pickups, and text messaging back then? Required you to go to town or the Western Union and somebody would tap, tap, tap message somebody, wouldn't they? And even 25 years before that, 4 horsepower meant exactly that, 4 horses. And it's hard to believe now, but back then, there were 2 1-billion bushel crops raised in America, and one of them was oats. And back then, there were 45 million acres of oats in America. This year, there's 3 million. In fact, back then when my grandparents were married, 1 in 4 acres of everything went to horses. If you had a horse, 1 in 4 acres was either binned, bagged, or barned for that horse flesh, and 1 in 5 hours of every hour spent on the farm was spent with or taking care of those horses. Well, there's 2 points to this brief history, obviously. The first is, most of us remember it. Most of us have deep connections to at least 3 generations of agriculture. We've lived, most of us, 2, and we've known people who've lived all 4 that I'm talking about. We may not think we're old. We're old. We're old. because we've seen farmers and farm communities change dramatically in just the 4 generations that I mentioned, in just 2 generations that most of us have lived. And the second point is equally obvious, that most farmers don't farm today like their fathers farmed, and their fathers didn't farm like their fathers. And truth be, 25 years, whomever follows you will be farming differently than you. You know that, right? I mean, do you even farm the way you farmed 25 years ago? 10 years ago? I doubt it. And yet, in this fast-churning ocean of change, some things never change. Good, wholesome food, be it fresh, frozen, or prepared, grown in a good, wholesome way, without genetic alteration or tongue-twisting phonetic alliteration, sold at a fair and honest price in fair and honest markets, should be the goal of all farmers and ranchers, no matter their size or the operations or the crop or the livestock or the mix or the generation who grows it. That's neither complicated nor, anymore it seems, easy. I mean, growing quality food now should be easier than it was 25 years ago, right? After 25 years of muscle, sweat, taunts, jeers, and market building, we should have it easier. And in some ways it is. In some ways it very well is. But there's other ways, perhaps, that aren't. And those ways, they'll become the work of a new generation that's ready and roaring, and they're young, and they're ambitious, and they're good. That's the way they should be. After all, you raised them. And with them, you raise the standards. And so the food that most people expect in America now today is the food you grow. You grow. Not they, you. And I'll just add, yesterday, I was reading the paper this morning, and I don't know if any of you know a guy named Robert Parlberg, but he teaches at Wellesley College out east, and he's a visiting lecturer at Harvard. And he was at the University of Nebraska yesterday giving their annual ag lecture, which I did about 5 years ago. They never invited me back. But Robert Parlberg would not be someone that you would agree a lot with. And yet yesterday at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln, he told Big Ag that he has not met one student in his classes in the most recent years who thinks anything Big Ag does is good. They all believe that Big Ag's bad. And what I find so revealing about that is that he had to find that out. And where does he eat? Well, that's the way I see it. That's my opinion. I am, remember, a professional opinionator. It's what I do for a living. In fact, I offer fact-based opinion each and every week to newspaper readers around the United States and Canada. And here's the good part. I give it to them whether they want it or not. And it's not that hard, folks. It's journalism. It's inside work with no heavy lifting. Well, a little. But since that's what I do, and since you invited me here, I guess you also figured you're going to get some opinion. Fair guess? Well, get ready. It's very, very hard for me to believe free markets exist anywhere in the American ag economy, especially in today's American agriculture. Oh, we talk endlessly about the sanctity of free markets, don't we? But rare is there anyone who does anything ever about them. I mean, the latest example of free market talk is all the talk about trade talks. I mean, our leaders assure us that we need free trade to ensure, quote, the free market, unquote, continues to dominate world banking. How are they doing? American car manufacturing, how's that going? Computer, software, insurance, you name it. And yet, when the world actually sits down and negotiates free trade, as it is doing right now with the 13-year-old negotiations for the World Trade Organization's Doha round, they never get past one topic: agriculture. And they never get past agriculture because the three biggest ag nations, ag unions in the world, stop it. And those three are Japan, the European Union, and the United States of America. And they do it because of some very good reasons, at least in Japan and Europe. Japan, that wasn't meant to be a punchline. Glad you see the humor to this. Japan does it, of course, because of rice. What other food is more central to their culture than rice? And you know what? If the Japanese want to eat their own rice, I'm all for the Japanese eating their own rice. The EU has even deeper cultural ties to food and farming. And by that I mean, when any of you think of Italy, what do you think about? I'll say Sophia Loren, okay? Spaghetti, vino, pizza, carbonara. I mean, you think of food. You think of food. Whenever you think of France, do you think first of the Louvre or the Eiffel? Or do you maybe think of bread, cheese, wine, right? The same is true for every country in Europe. What do you think about when you think of Germany? Beer. Yeah. Well, I think of beer. What do you think of when you think of Ireland? Beer. Spain, tapas. The Netherlands, pork. You can't name a country in Europe without thinking of food. Portugal, port. Why? Because Europe, despite its big and growing continent-wide union, despite its official count of 7 languages, despite an incredibly dysfunctional European Parliament, and by the most recent economic mess that was a disaster for several countries, they still have deep, deep cultural ties to farming and to food. And whenever I ask Americans, who have visited Europe, what are the 2 things they remember best, invariably the 2 answers are, the food. Oh, the food's unbelievable. Unbelievable food we ate. Oh, we ate. And the second thing, all them little farm towns. They all had bakeries. They all had little breweries. They had artisan cheese plants. And the food, unbelievable in those little towns. And so, as the conversation continues, I ask them, do you think that was an accident? Do you think that just stayed there because of no reason at all? Or do you think that they had policy that directed it that way? When you talk about the remarkable little villages and the remarkable food that you find anywhere in Europe, on the street, it's their way of, as the Italians would say, la dolce vita, the good life, the good life. And it really isn't a holdover by stubborn Germans or hard-headed Swedes. It's just the way it is. Food. Europe's agricultural policy was built by and helps finance farms and farming communities. You know what they call it over there? Agriculture. Agriculture, 2 words. Their food is their culture. Their culture is their food. Why is this such a blind... in journalism, we call that a BGO. Blinding glimpse of the obvious. I remember so well as a kid reporter, and I wasn't a kid, but it took me 7 years to get through college. I left 3 times. Once the dean asked me to leave. The other 2 times I just left. But in 1981, I remember so well being lectured so sternly by my older, smarter, more cynical colleagues that there's no way the European Union could continue the ag policy that they had. And you know why? It's expensive. They couldn't afford to keep them little villages or those little farms. $3 billion a year their ag policy cost them. $3 billion a year. Who could afford that? And then, of course, their prediction was that within the term of our next Farm Bill, 5 years, Europe would be gone. Well, anybody here remember the 1981? Anybody remember the 1981 Farm Bill? What happened right after that? We had kind of a big collapse, remember? I mean, it wasn't a big collapse. It was on the face, full butt collapse. And for the gray beards and gray hairs out here today, who do you think poured more money into their agriculture between 1981 and 1985, Europe or the United States? And we poured more money in just to save what we had. You know, even after that, even after our farmers and ranchers regained their footing in the late 80s, our policymakers continued to recommend a free market theology on the basis that U.S. farm policy would feed the world. And they continued to condemn European spending. The EU would go broke, and on and on and on they went. So what did we do again? We passed another farm bill. In 1996, we called it Freedom to Farm. Remember that? Yeah, who can forget that? Congressman Pat Roberts from Kansas, chairman of the House Ag Committee, lectured everybody who he could catch about how this, quote, innovative, unique, remarkable, unquote, ag policy was going to change the world. It's going to take the shackles of government off of American farmers. It was going to be a 7-year program that cost $42 billion. Well, it was so ruinous that, and it brought 99-cent corn. Remember that? 1999, 99-cent corn? I thought it was very clever of Pat. That farm bill lasted only 6 years and cost $120 billion. So the Europeans still had it wrong? We still had it wrong because, you know, we threw it out in 2002 and started over. But of course, we didn't throw out Pat Roberts. You know where he is today, don't you? He's ascended to the highest perch of incompetency. He's now a U.S. Senator from Kansas. And the U.S. Senate is where he probably remains, because earlier this month, he voted against the 2014 Farm Bill because it wasn't free market enough. Pat is still trying to destroy agriculture from the U.S. Congress. And he's trying to retain his seat. Did you read the story in the New York Times a couple weeks ago? He's in serious trouble in Kansas. He doesn't live there anymore. He hasn't lived there in 30 years. You know what he lists as his address? I'm not making this up, because I couldn't make this up. I mean, I'm good, but I'm not that good. It's a recliner in the living room of one of his friends. Yeah, that's his home address. He pays rent for it, $30 a month. But all the while this was going on, European agriculture, of course, it was going right along. It's chugging right along. It shifted its farm subsidy programs to more green payments, to more environmentally based food culture. And, you know, in Europe, you won't find anybody really debating GMOs or antibiotics in meat. You know why? They don't want them. They've somehow managed to have thousands upon thousands of years of culture without them. And they just don't think they're necessary. Well, who are we to tell them what's necessary? Well, we're Americans. But it continues to spend money on farms and farmers and food. And today, the European Union spends $80 billion a year on food and farm programs. $80 billion. By far the biggest line item of any food budget. But they're honest about it, aren't they? They're honest. And they ticket the money to farms and farm communities. We continue to complain about it, that they're going to fail. They're going to fail. You know, I'll wait another generation for that to come true, I suppose. They haven't in the past. You know, you don't find the European Union's complaining. Anyone in the European Union complaining about $80 billion a year? Not one complains. Instead, the locals can be found slicing off a fresh piece of locally made bread, putting on some locally made butter on it or cheese, grabbing some locally grown olives or smoked eel, just caught eel. Yeah, it's not bad. Pouring another glass of locally made wine, doing what? Say, hey, how you doing? Enjoying life. La dolce vita. The European model is not without its pitfalls and not without its problems, of course, as I just explained. I mean, it is expensive. But it does, however, take into account more community health than the U.S. ag policy. It values the farmer or the vintner or the arborist or the cheesemaker as much as it values anyone else in the economy, from politician right down to the union craftsman. Now contrast that to that picture painted by our big ag groups. You know, the big ag groups that talk about food to consumers. This is what they say, and I'm trying not to exaggerate here, but it's easy. This is what they say. Imagine this is big ag talking to a consumer. Hey! Did you know we feed you and 238 other Americans? So here's what you need to do with that piece of information. Shut up. Shut up about atrazine. Shut up about GMOs and GMO labeling. Shut up about Roundup. Shut up about antibiotics in meat. Shut up about phosphorus runoff in the Great Lakes. Shut up about dead-to-life zones in the Gulf of Mexico the size of Connecticut. And shut up about chicken potential imports from China, potential beef imports from Brazil, dairy powder from New Zealand. Just shut up. I get mad because that makes me mad. That's not how we do it in this country, is it? So why do they? Why do they? And here's how they usually end this up, either through just straight out words or through implications. Get on your knees and thank me for farming. Thank me for growing your food. And here's one other thing. Shut up. We got this. Trust us. And like I said, I exaggerate to make the point, but the key message sent by U.S. farmers and ranchers today is that they know best, the customer doesn't. It's paternalism. But here's a word they don't like to hear in this context. It's exceptionalism. They think they're exceptional. I don't care if they think they're exceptional, but somebody should tell them that they're not. Because what they do is nothing exceptional. You know, they farm. There's about 1.2 million people out here farm every day and 2.1 million people who farm either full or part-time. What's exceptional is they're running other people out of business doing it. They are right about some critical elements of the American ag market. One is that the American consumer has really gotten very, very far removed from farms, ranches, and farming practices. They don't know where their food comes from. If they did, you think they'd buy that? Many of them have not tasted fresh food. Truly good, fresh food prepared correctly. Let me tell you about a quick story about one of the reasons why this has happened. About 8 or 9 years ago, my wife, the lovely Catherine, and I were visiting our daughter, Mary Grace. Well, she lived in Rome for 2 years. And she made a lot of friends. And 2 of these friends were Enrico and Francesco. And oh yeah. They gorgeous boys, if you could say that about 2 22-year-old guys. 6 foot tall, curly hair, stubbly little beard, penetrating eyes. So one night we're there visiting, and Mary Grace says to us, Enrico and Francesco, Dad, would like to take you out for a beer. My middle name. Which incidentally, I don't have a middle name, so I gave myself that middle name. And so we meet them for dinner, and then they take us out to what they call the cheap bar in Rome. Well, when you're in Rome, anything that says cheap bar, you go to. So off we went, because we're cheapskates. And really what a cheap bar was the back door of somebody's house where they sold beer out the back door. And you stood in the alley and you drank it. So we had this, we were standing out at the cheapskates of all of Rome. We're standing in this alley drinking beer, and our cheap beers. When the talk turned to the fabulous dinner we had just had, it was pizza. Put his hand tossed, wood fire, great big egg right in the middle of it. Right, yeah. When in Rome. And one of the boys, Francesco, turns to Catherine, my wife, and then with a very serious look, says to Catherine he has a question. And Catherine looks way up past that stubbly beard, that curly hair, and those gorgeous brown eyes. Ready for the question, which she was going to say yes to. And Francesco says, in as good English as he can muster, "Ma'am, why you Americans eat in cars?" Why do we eat in cars? Well, we eat in cars because we see food as fuel. What else is it? I mean, we stop at filling stations and we call them McDonald's. And we stop at gas stations and we call them food. I mean, good grief, we even give names for modes of transportation. Subway. If you're eating a Subway on a subway, you're American. My son Paul, an officer in the U.S. Navy, when he was stationed in Norfolk, Virginia, well, to finish that story, Catherine couldn't answer it. And then he had a second question. Our son, 33, law degree, officer in the Navy, unmarried. Unmarried. He's Irish. Half Irish. That half is Irish. So Enrico, the other gorgeous Italian boy, says to Catherine, Catherine, why Paul not live with his mama? Yeah, that's what Catherine did. That's exactly what she did. Oh. I thought we came home, she was going to invite the boy back. But when he was stationed in Norfolk, Virginia, he was stationed on two different ships there, the USS New York, and then the aircraft carrier, the newest one, the George H.W. Bush. But Paul would, every day he'd leave his apartment, and he found the most wonderful thing for a guy like Paul. This massive food and fuel and fructose stop called Wawa. Anybody know about Wawa out east? Unbelievable place, isn't it? I mean, do they actually sell gas? So Paul would stop there every morning on his way to the ship, and he would buy 1 cup of coffee, 2 pieces of toast, and 1 case of heartburn. He called that breakfast. That's what we do in America. That's how we eat. A lot of us eat. And if you change that, you change everything. Early last fall, I wrote a less than rose-colored essay for the Daily Yonder on the near total vacancy of rural America. I mean, one of the essay's highlights, and one of rural America's real lowlights, is the observation of how we turned our small-town needs over to 1 or 2 gas station chains. When did we do that? I mean, you need milk? Go to Casey's. You need beer? Go to 7-Eleven. You need coffee or donut? Get and go at Get and Go. You need community conversation? You go to the Fast Stop. More than that, however, in my part of Illinois, those convenience stores all seem to be located on the edge of every little town, right next to the big cornfields, which is kind of good, because within a year, everything sold at those places, corn chips, fructose-based candies and sodas, ethanol, starch-laden snacks, all come from that corn. And that's what people buy there. What does it say about the American psyche or American soul that we view gas and go joints as our grocery stores? And we view it as progress. How do you explain to the Francescos of the world that the United States, though the biggest commodity producing nation in the world, probably in the history of the world, has food deserts, one town after another in this most bountiful part of its nation in the Midwest? And yet we brag, and we brag, and we brag, and we brag, and we brag that our ag policy delivers the cheapest food in the world. Not the best, not the most nutritious, not the most humanely raised, not the highest quality, not the most beneficial to the community. No, the cheapest. Tell me something. Is that your goal? You truly want to grow the cheapest chicken in the world? The cheapest tomato? Do you want to be the cheapest low-cost producer of a commodity, or do you want to be a farmer who supplies quality at a price that delivers both value and a profit? You don't want to be a cheapskate. That's a recipe for a short-term recipe at that, for long-term failure. Look around. Look at all the farmers who have tried. 100,000, 200,000 in the last generation, 300,000. I mean, if you need to know if it succeeds, look around and see where it hasn't. It's everywhere where it hasn't succeeded. But it's also the recipe that most of our bigger farm organizations preach in order to cook up all these sunny forecasts of ever-growing exports for commodities like corn and soybeans, even as Americans in America grows whiter and heavier on the steady diet of sugar and starch and calories served up by an ag policy built on cheap. Why is it that all these cheap commodities deliver the most expensive problems? I mean, hasn't any policymaker ever noticed that these farm policies deliver an economy built on fructose or cattle feedlots or almost a totally integrated hog and poultry sector? A food machine that both makes, honors, worships, and delivers ethanol? You know, I know that's a touchy subject with farmers. But does anyone here believe that's the long-term solution to our problem? Do you know it takes 1 million gallons of water to grow 1 acre, 200 bushel corn? 1 million gallons of water to grow 200 bushel corn, and the ethanol conversion out of that corn be about 500 gallons of ethanol out of that 200 bushel of corn. Do you think that's fair trade in the long term? Would you trade 500 gallons of ethanol for 1 million gallons of water right now? That's what we're doing, and nobody's even asking you. I just did. Those questions aren't even being asked. Because when we talk about cheap, we're too busy producing. Because cheap means I got to make a lot. You know, as a side note, I'd just like to add that the most politically conservative policymakers abhor the very idea of a national industrial policy. You know, like Japan or Germany that focused all their national will on problems and solved them. Miniaturization of electronics, car manufacturing. But America can't do that, say our loudest Ayn Randians. Because government can't pick winners, and they sure as hell should not pick losers. Right? That, of course, is highly selective, very, very 100% grade A baloney. Because if they've ever voted for a farm bill, that's exactly what they did. They picked winners, corn and soybeans, and they've made out losers: cattle, poultry, hogs, of every farmer in America. So whenever they say they can't pick winners and make losers, kind of laugh. Your job's done. Walk away. You're not going to convince them. They're wrong. Now back to our regular programming. We have the food policy we do because, quite frankly, we researched it, we designed it, we wrote it, we codified it, and we sold it to taxpayers, and then we backstopped it with the full force of the U.S. government with periodic farm legislation like the one just passed. If you think otherwise, you have not been paying attention for 30 years. This approach has brought us to the pinnacle of commodity production, of course, and no nation's ever built a commodity-producing behemoth like the United States with fewer farmers than ever before and fewer ranchers. But this incredible and efficient farm and ranch machine doesn't produce a lot of food. In fact, I wrote a column about 2 years ago, and I highlighted Darrell Ray, who's an Iowa farm boy who now runs the ag policy shop at the University of Tennessee. And it also featured an Iowa dietitian. Her name is Amy Tagtow, and another researcher of Amy's. And what I did, I contrasted what Ray's research had shown to what Tagtow's research on food. Darrell Ray had done research on farm exports. Tagtow had done research on food, just food. She's very clever. She actually totaled up the amount of total calories grown by Iowa farmers in 1 year. Now think about that. Pretty clever, huh? Darrell Ray, actually, what he did, he went back 30 years from 1980 to 2010 to see once if all our export-directed ag policy had actually increased exports. And you know what he found? That of the big 5 food grains, corn, and it's food, everywhere in the world, but here it's food. Corn, rice, oats, wheat, barley, that over 30 years, from 1980 to 2010, U.S. ag exports actually fell 18%. 18%. And the only way that they were even on par in 2010 with 1980 is if you throw soybeans in there because of the fabulous growth of soybeans and its hydrogenated oil around the world. 30 years, 5 farm bills directed at exports, and we didn't increase exports one pound, one bushel, or one bucket. And yet, we still talk about it. Big Ag still talks about it. It's the holy grail. It's their nirvana. You know what nirvana is, don't you? Seriously. The perfect state of nothingness, right? And yet, we still talk about feed the world. But over those 30 years, the American share of the export markets has fell from 54%. We had 54% of the whole world export market in 1981. And in 2011, we had 34%. So not only didn't we export more, we actually lost market share to the rest of the world while the world's population doubled. That's a clever trick. So we're just basically residual suppliers, and that's what our ag policy directs. So I looked at Amy Tagtow's research, and this was fascinating. She went back to the 1978 ag census because in her mind it had the best numbers, the most recent. They're only done every 4 or 5 years, so she couldn't coincide exactly with what Darrell was doing. But a 1978 ag census showed on Iowa that 50% of Iowa farms grew hogs, 60% had cattle, 56% had hay, and 34% had oats, 1978. By 2002, just 2002, the hog number had fallen from 50% to 12, the cattle from 60% to 33, the hay from 56% to 36, and oats, they just disappeared, man. So, and I'm not waxing nostalgic here about the way it was. I want to return the way it was. I'm just describing the way it is. How this diverse farming in one of the biggest ag states in America has become this monolith of commodities. taken across the nation, you know, you can see that the 30-year shift away from diversity towards monoculture means we're not growing enough food. We're not growing food in this country anymore. And here's the evidence. If even USDA, when they researched the domestic market, says if every American followed their guidelines, their healthy eating guidelines every day, the U.S. would need 7.6 million more acres of fruit production, 6.5 million more acres of vegetables, and 11 billion pounds more milk. Our public servants are doing us a public service. And the only reason we have enough today, we import it. We have had a farm policy directed at exports, and what we do, we don't grow any food. We have to import food. According to USDA, the value of vegetable imports to the United States has more than doubled in the last 15 years, and the value of fruit and nuts imported to the United States has tripled. We have focused on commodity exports so that we're increasingly relying on other countries to produce the food we eat. It's amazing. Well, Amy took a look at what that meant for Iowa. And here's what it meant. It meant that only 0.04% of all the farmland in Iowa was farmed for food, for fruit and vegetables. 0.04%. And that tiny, tiny, tiny number, you know what that means? That means that 85% of the $9 billion people spent on food in Iowa left the state. That's the economic train wreck we see in rural America. You know, it's no big secret. It's not hard to see once you lift the veil. And once you cut through the words that pour forth from Big Ag. If you want a farming state like Iowa, and Illinois really, any state really, you want to create jobs and real economic impact in the community, in the county, the state, invite your local policymaker to a dinner you make and let him eat something fresh. And tell him that's the way it used to be. And tell him it still can. Facts like that are not that hard to come by. I mean, I found them. So I would encourage you that some of you, many of you, all of you, maybe have to be like Cincinnatus. Put the plow down. He picked up a sword. I don't recommend that. But you all got pitchforks? I didn't say what you needed to do with them. You people have fertile imaginations. Must be the organic food you eat. Now, I'm running out of time, but I want to talk about one other thing. But before I do, I want to ask you, how's that opinion thing going? I'm doing okay? You might want that back in a few minutes. I make my living with words. You know, there's an old saying in journalism that any army of the world will be defeated by 26 little soldiers of lead. That's the alphabet in type. And as such, I'm pretty picky about my words. You know, I've gone slow here because if I don't, I get less picky. But I want to talk about the difference between the words inform and educate. Now you're here because this is an educational forum. You've come here to be informed. You've come here to learn. You've come here to hear new ideas, new concepts, new methods. I would maintain that my education, I got people who could prove this for me, probably stopped about the end of the first grade. When these very smart people figured out how to teach you to read. And once you learn to read, you pretty much educated yourself, because then you could become discriminating and become, the pusher of ideas, and you sought out your own stuff. And here's proof. Here's proof that you educated yourself even in grade school. Homework. We all did homework. I don't have any problem with the words the way they're used, either by Moses or by me. I have a problem the way big ag groups use them. Big ag groups are busy trying to quote what? Educate. Educate farmers. Educate the public. They need money to educate. Why? Why? They're so busy educating consumers that they don't inform them. Why do consumers need education on GMOs? Think they don't have enough? Or do you think they have enough information they've already made up their mind? So it's simple why these groups want to, quote, educate. Because they don't want consumers to make the choice. They have made the choice. They will make it for you if you can't. In fact, they've made it for you. And I've said this for years about what I do. My job is not to convince you that what I think or what I say or what I write is the way you should think. That's not what I do. That's not what anybody should really do. What I do is give you all the information that I can find and present it in a form that's readily available, so that when it comes time for you to make a choice, you agonize over it. Because if you agonize over it, you know what you're going to do? You're going to make the right choice for you, for your community, for your family, for your farm, for your church. Probably not the choice I would make. It's the choice you have to make. So if all farm groups ever did was to give people information to make wise choices, I'll bet you and I wouldn't be here today, because we wouldn't have to be here to counter all of this. Now, I'm going to take a few more minutes to give you some facts really fast about that I think are important. I think they're very important because of where you are as a group, where you are as farmers in this great scheme of things called American agriculture. Farm groups love to play the influence game. They're good at it. Oh, I should give full disclosure first. Some of people know this. I'm not embarrassed by it. My oldest brother, Richard, great guy, terrific euchre player. Big boy farmer, 2,500, 3,000 acres, southern Illinois. Is also the president of the Illinois Farm Bureau. Isn't that interesting? Mom and Dad always liked him best. We get along fine. Everybody thinks that's a strange revelation. We get along fine. We just don't talk about politics, but we do talk about policy. So, and I could say some other things that are quite clever, but they'll bounce back. This is being recorded. So Richard will see him, and I still love him. He is my brother. He ain't heavy, but he's my brother. The one issue I want to talk about briefly here is commodity checkoffs. And I want to talk about them in light of one current checkoff. They all came into being about in the mid-'80s. And there's 18 federally chartered, in other words, congressionally written checkoffs. Most of them are mandatory. Most of them are non-refundable. But I want to talk about one. And I want to talk about, it's not the biggest one. It's beef, the beef checkoff. In fact, it's kind of puny compared to the rest of them. But here's what I want you to do, and you think about these numbers when I give them to you, and you make up your own mind. I'm not making up these numbers. You make up your own mind. In 1980, there were 111 million head of cattle in the United States. 2012, there were 90.8 million head. In 1980, the total cattle slaughter was 36.8 million head. 2012 is 33.9. In 1980, U.S. per capita beef consumption was 76.6 pounds. 2012 is 57.4 pounds. In 1980, U.S. cattle imports were 615,000 head. 2012 cattle imports were 2.1 million head. And incidentally, the rest of the world, all the other the nations combined, only imported 1 million head of cattle. In 1980, net cattle imports equaled 1.7% of U.S. slaughter. In 2012, they were 6.1%. So in 32 years, the U.S. has seen cattle production fall by 20 million head, slaughter fall by 3 million head, beef consumption dropped by 20 pounds per capita, while poultry incidentally went from 49 to 105. Witness cattle imports climbed by 1.5 million head, or 340%. And while cattle producer numbers in this nation fell by 50%. And one other thing occurred during that period. The beef checkoff went into effect in 1986 to promise better markets, more cattlemen, better cattle. Now, this it has most decidedly not done. It has not increased the cattle numbers, it's not increased per capita consumption, it's not increased producer numbers, and it sure has not limited imports. Now, do you think you need a checkoff? That's up to you. That's up to you. And you can decide that. You will decide that. But here's what I would say. And I could do this chapter and verse if you'd like, on corn, on soybeans, on pork, chapter and verse. But here's what I would say. I've looked into every checkoff. Checkoffs have been very good to me because they've given me some of my best material. Every time I've looked into checkoffs, I've found something untoward, if not outright corruption. I'm not saying that's what happened to yours. But that has happened to every one. These are the facts. Now, you want to check off? Go right ahead. Make it transparent. Make it completely accountable. Make it farmer-directed. And if you want me to be more plain about that, that means farmers are on the board. That means farmers, not business, not industry, farmers are on the board. Because you know who you're doing this for? You. Your money. You should have the say. And here's why. Outside the obvious reason, here's why. You all heard of a thing called U.S. Farmers and Ranchers Alliance? It's a St. Louis-based group formed out of thin air by big ag business and big ag groups. And what do? Well, here's what they say they do. Here's their preamble. They consist of more than 80 farmer and rancher-led organizations and agriculture partners representing virtually all aspects of agriculture. Well, you go to their website and you look at who are those 80 farmer groups. My brother would love this. 47 of those 80 groups are affiliated somehow with the American Farm Bureau Federation, the American Soybean Association, and the National Corn Growers. That's three groups that are really good at groupthink. They'll do the thinking. And who are the agricultural partners? Well, here's what their website says. They're DuPont, Deere & Company, Monsanto, BAS, Cargill, Dow, Elanco, Merck, Syngenta, and Farm Credit. That's just a few. But here's the thing. The soybean checkoff has given them $3 million. The beef checkoff has given them $250,000. And the pork checkoff has given them $3 million. Now, do you think any of those groups are working for you? What do you think U.S. Farmers and Ranchers Alliance is supposed to do? It's supposed to put your face on their methods. They want to look like you, but they can't. And you know why they can't? You're not a member. This is what happens when you lose control of your checkoffs. These checkoffs came into effect 25 years ago and have never been voted on since. Never. There's a new generation of farmers paying checkoff who've never voted for them. Is that American? You're going to do a checkoff, do it right. Study the ones that are out there and don't do that. See what I mean about free advice? It's easy. It's easy for me. It comes natural. Look, you can do what you want. And you know how I know that? You have. You're still doing it. You've got growing pains. You're reaching out. You're trying to figure this out. Reach out to each other. You know, you can vote any way you want, but keep in mind consumers vote every day. And you do too. Think back. Think back just one generation, and how you've grown, and what you now offer, and how many of you are gathered here today that weren't here 25 years ago. 25 years ago, you might have held some pretty wild dreams of where you would be today. But I would bet you every dollar in my wallet, none of you thought it would be this big. Not one of you. Well, where are you going to be in another 25? Are you going to be 30 or 40 times bigger than you are today, as you are today than you were then? I'll bet you'll be bigger. I'll bet you'll be 50 times bigger. Because you figured it out. You know how to do it. Agriculture never stops changing. Nothing ever stops changing. Look around at all these young people. Be carrying you and me and these ideas and this idealism into the future. You ready? They are. Doggone right they're ready. Just ask them. You didn't have the courage to ask your dad, did you? I didn't have to. My dad told me. Well, this is about more than self. This is about more than just soil. This is about soul. This is about soul. And, you know, we can all look at where we are, what we do, and why we do it. And to a person, it boils down to soul. It's soul. You know, as a not very good Lutheran, hope there's some of my people out here. You remember what Martin Luther said when he was faced death at the Diet of Worms, and the papal nuncio was there to say, ask him, why have you done all of this? And Luther's answer was simple. He said, I do this because I can do no other. Pretty simple. And I think that's why I do what I do. I mean, I don't like driving through snowstorms to deliver messages that sometimes people don't like to hear. But I do it because it doesn't make me feel good. I do it because I can't do anything else. You can't either. You can't either. Now, get going. You got 25 more years. Let's go. Good luck. Thank you.